Okay, and welcome back. This next kind of couple sections, I should say, is really where the rubber meets the proverbial road. We're going to start talking about endpoints, endpoint groups, application profiles, contracts, filters, subjects, all the stuff that really makes ACI what it is, okay? Because remember, based on, I think it was one of the initial lectures, we kind of spoke about how we're not classifying anymore based on a specific VLAN or a specific subnet boundary, right? I said, again, in the beginning, and if you came into this with no knowledge of ACI, it might have kind of flew straight over your head or in one ear out the other, depending on what you like to call it. But we're classifying stuff now based on endpoints. And endpoints themselves are going to be, our bare metal servers. If we have any external networks, whether layer 2 or layer 3, whether we have a VMM, virtual machine domain, and we have a bunch of virtual machines with a bunch of virtual NICs, those are going to be considered the endpoints to the ACI fabric. We're going to contain these endpoints within things that we call endpoint groups. And endpoint groups, as we're going to talk about, actually reside in these things called application profiles. So we're going to go over both of those in quite a bit of detail. And then as we go through a lot of the lecture, and more specifically the demos, you guys are going to see us actually put endpoints onto the ACI fabric and leverage those to write policy against. And again, this is a different way of thinking about networking, because endpoint groups are going to be basically collections of endpoints, but they don't necessarily have to be in, say, the same subnet or the same VLAN, but they're going to get treated almost exactly the same way. Okay, so again, it's a different way to think about it. And let's again get my mug out of the way and talk about EPGs just a little bit. So endpoint groups. And I think, hold on one second here while I bring up my notebook. There we go. Let me bring up my notebook so I can actually draw a little bit on the screen here. There we go. And bring my whiteboard up. One moment, guys. Sorry, bear with me. Guys and gals, I should say. Come on, notebook. We need you. We need you in our life. If we can't draw, we're not really doing anything, right? Should have came up. I don't know where it is. Where'd you go, little guy? There you are. There you are. All right. So what we're going to talk about now are these endpoint groups. And again, they're just a collection of really endpoints. Right? Again, within a data center, what are going to be our endpoints? We're talking about things like our servers, right? Maybe specific networking devices, storage devices. So when we classify these things into endpoint groups, we're not doing it anymore based on, say, our VLANs. Woo. Again, I'm just full of problems today here. Yeah, it's not working for me. What the heck? Did I not go transparent, Scotty? There we go. Yeah, it must have died on me. Go into transparent mode. Yeah, usually I have a way I can kind of overlay my screen here, and it's not letting me. So I guess we'll just use the whiteboard kind of when we need to. So no longer are we really classifying based on, an IP address or a specific VLAN, or even a port for that matter, right? Because now what we're doing is we're going to group stuff together kind of as they are. So if we have certain servers that need to be treated the same, maybe a bunch of web servers that are only ever going to be accessed on port 80 and 443, we would tend to put those in the same what we call endpoint group. And again, it's just going to be a collection of endpoints that technically require the same policy. There's a couple different types of EPGs. We have what's known as the application EPG, and we're going to use those a lot for like our virtual machine manager EPGs as we push port groups off to VMware. We're going to use external layer 2 and layer 3 endpoint groups when we configure layer 2 and layer 3 external domains. And then management EPGs. And I've got little asterisks by these guys because these guys are not contained within these application profiles that we're going to talk about in a minute. Don't worry about that for now. I'm going to circle back around and talk about that in some more detail here in just a little bit. So again, endpoint groups are a little bit more flexible than our traditional way of classifying nodes, right? Because typically before, and again, I had an example of this, I think during one of the very first lectures. Why is this not erasing? Man, I just can't do anything right today. So, and I had that example up there where we had a node like 192.168, 10.1, and maybe when he went to his first hop, or maybe we'll call it router 1, we would apply some policy on it. So we might have an ACL that we use. We might have some application network services. So we might be sending that guy through a load balancer. We might be pushing him through an IPS, IDS. We might even be doing some policy-based routing based on his IP address, okay, or maybe a certain service that he was using. So what happens when we take this IP address, or even the VLAN that it's associated with, and maybe we change that guy. Maybe we change that to 192.168, 10.2. Does it get the same policy applied? Right? We don't know. It could or it couldn't, depending on the type of policy that we actually wrote in the background. So we don't have to deal with that anymore with endpoint groups. They're what Cisco kind of calls them flexible and extendable, meaning if we come in and we change the IP address, the policy around it's not going to change because the policy is written around this actual endpoint group and not that individual endpoint or a group of endpoints maybe identified by subnet or VLAN. So it's just a different way of thinking about it. So within this particular EPG that I kind of just threw up here, maybe we have 6 different servers in there. Maybe 4 of them are in 172.16.10.0/24 subnet, and the other 2 are in 10.10.20/24. Guys, all these servers are going to be treated exactly the same because, again, the policy is written around this endpoint group and not necessarily around the subnet that they're contained within. Okay, so it's just a different way of thinking about it. Now, there are a couple different things that we have to know. Nodes within an EPG inherently can communicate. Okay, so if all these guys are in the same EPG, they're going to be able to talk without any contracts being written. Okay, if you go between different EPGs, you have to have a contract in place in order for those guys to be able to communicate together. And I'm having all kinds of problems with my, that'll work. We'll just erase it. Having all kinds of problems with my whiteboard program here. Let me go back over and I'll give you an example of this. So imagine that we have, let me actually just use this guy. We'll call this guy, maybe EPG users. And within this EPG, maybe we have a group of users. We'll call this, user 1, user 2, and user 3. Again, I'm using pretty simplistic examples here. It's going to be a little bit different in actual practice. But when you have, these 3 different endpoints within this EPG, this is what we refer to as intra-EPG communication, okay? So again, inherently, these guys are going to be able to communicate. Now, I think it was with the latest Brazos release, they do have a knob now, because a lot of people complained about this, and they're like, well, we don't necessarily want the different endpoints in the same EPG being able to communicate. So now we have the ability, when we go and build out an EPG, we can classify whether we want to allow or disallow communication between the endpoints within that EPG. I will tell you that it employs kind of a private VLAN type environment. So when you go in there, it's almost like putting all these guys in their same isolated private VLAN if you disallow intra-EPG communication. But again, typically what we're going to see, and I think what I'm going to do in all my demos, is I'm actually going to go in there and I'm just going to allow the default nature and allow those guys to be able to communicate. The other one, say we create another EPG, and say we create this EPG, and let's call it web, okay? And we come in here and we create, web server 1, we create web server 2, and we create web server 3. And let's say that these users, they need to access these different web servers. Okay, so they need to be able to communicate to those guys on some specific ports. And we're going to talk about this, and again, I'm going to put it in another video so that we can kind of hit it from every angle. But in order to facilitate this communication, we have to have what's known as a contract in place. Okay, so it's basically, in actuality, a contract is going to be able to filter traffic, allow traffic on just specific ports. We could even do some service training. So we, if we had layer 4 through 7 stuff that we needed to do, we could send these guys through different firewalls, say through virtual ASA, through load balancers like F5, and we can handle all that through the use of these contracts. Now what's going to happen is the contract's going to contain these things called subjects and filters, and don't worry, we're going to get into this a little bit more detail later. But maybe we just want to allow, TCP, port 80, and port 443 through, okay? What we do is we write this contract that contains the proper filters in order to just allow these guys. And again, ACI uses what's called a provider and consumer relationship. So what we would do is we would actually provide this contract from the web EPG, okay, and we would consume this contract from the user EPG. And that would allow basically these users to communicate with these web servers on these specific ports. All right, make sense? So that's what we really get in and we start to do with endpoints. We classify them so that we can base policy around them and basically dictate how and on what, kind of ports, I guess, those guys are allowed to communicate. Make sense? Again, that's going to be through the use of contracts and filters, and we'll get a little bit more into that here in just a little bit. So endpoint groups themselves, we have a couple different ways that we can classify into an endpoint group. And one of the important things I want you to note is these endpoint groups, these are called application EPGs. These are contained within application profiles, and we're going to talk about those here in just a second. But you don't get EPGs themselves. You won't have access to any EPGs until you actually create an actual endpoint group, okay? So the first way, and I think this is actually going to be the first demo that we do, is we're going to talk about these bare metal servers. These are going to be done under basically this VM and bare metal domain. And that's how we're going to classify traffic into this specific endpoint group that we have right here. So when we use this, it's going to push the EPG out to a VMM domain and basically assign an endpoint by placing them into a specific port group. Okay. We also have static path and static leaf binding. The static path binding is going to let you place an object into an EPG by basically a port and VLAN combination. Okay, so maybe we come in, let me erase this. Maybe we come into a switch, and I've kind of given this example a little bit before, but imagine that we have a leaf switch. Let's call this leaf 1. And we have a port over here. Well, we could have, a bare metal server sitting off this guy. Okay. Well, this server, maybe we just have a single NIC connected up, and maybe it's sending traffic in, untagged. Well, what we could do is we could create this static path binding and say, anything that comes in to this port untagged, okay, we want to place into this, maybe EPG bare metal, okay, and we can do that, and that's done with a static path binding. We could accept tag traffic as well. If you had, a server over here, maybe connected up to a different port, and maybe it was actually sending tagged traffic in on VLAN 50. You could accept that tag traffic on VLAN 50 through that port and stick it into that EPG, maybe BM. And that's bare metal, not bowel movement, but it could be either, depending on what kind of shop you run. But that is what we call a static path binding. The static leaf binding is basically doing that, except we're going to push it out to the entire leaf switch. There are some restrictions. We're not going to really get into that, but it's basically as we come into a leaf based on a certain VLAN encapsulation, we're going to push an EPG out to that entire switch. We also have the static endpoint where we can specify the specific MAC address, maybe switch port or a VLAN of a specific host, and stick it into that static endpoint classification and thus into that EPG. In this specific case, our EPG is actually named Army Endpoint Group. I think I'm going to get a little bit more granular as we go in and talk about our specific endpoints through our bare metal VMM domain, layer 2 and layer 3 domain. We'll create some more appropriately named endpoint groups through our discussions. And then the application profiles. Again, I say let's not make too much out of this. These are simply a collection of EPGs and the contracts that allow the communication between them. So if we had, the application EPG, this is what we call our typical three-tiered app, where we have the app EPG, the database EPG, and the web EPG. All the application profile is like a wrapper that goes around those guys. So the application profile is going to contain the EPGs, and then as we start to build the contracts that sit in the middle of these guys, it's also going to contain those contracts and who's providing and consuming those individual contracts. So don't freak out too much about the whole application profile thing. And kind of like I mentioned before, go back here. Notice how I've got the Army application profile. You're not going to be able to create an actual EPG with it. I should say you won't be able to create an application-based EPG until you actually get in here and create the application profile itself. It won't even be an option for you. You'll be like, where's my EPG, right? Well, you're not going to get the EPG until you create the app profile. And once you create the app profile, you're going to see a bunch of different options show up within your APIC GUI, and now you're going to have the ability to go in there and map a VMM domain or a specific port group. You're going to have the ability to do a static path, static leaf binding. All those options become available again once you create the actual application profile itself.